Okay, so the first thing then is Kripke's modal argument against the identity theory. So we looked at the identity theory last week, and then very briefly we looked at Kripke's argument. So the claim that he's making, that's him here, is that genuine identity statements, if they're true, they're necessarily true. That means that it's not necessarily true means not possibly false. Okay? Now the claim of the identity theorist is that pain is identical, in the way we talked about, to, say, C fibers firing. Now the problem that Kripke is pointing out is that mind-brain identity statements like this just don't seem to be necessarily true in the way that they would need to be. And so hence they're not true at all. So let's see how this is supposed to go. So take two sentences here, S1 and S2. The first is they're both identity claims. The first is a standard identity claim, empirical identity claim, so a posteriori theoretical claim, that water is identical to H2O. And then take the claim that we're talking about, S2, that pain is identical to C fibers firing. Now, we don't need to get hung up on the terminology that Kripke is using. He's using this term rigid designator. That just means that anything like water or H2O or pain, whatever is on one side of the identity claim, is going to count as a rigid designator if it refers to that thing in all possible worlds. Basically, it couldn't not refer to that thing. So the person giving the lecture today, that's a description. That could refer to lots of individuals, but my name can only refer to me on this view. Okay, so but the main point is that identity statements are like this, that have rigid designation properties, are necessarily true if true at all. Now, you might think, okay, well, I guess I can accept that claim that identity statements, if they're true at all, they're necessarily true. But when I look at those claims that water is H2O, pain is C fibers firing, it looks like they're not necessarily true. It looks like they're possibly false. I mean, couldn't water have not been H2O? If so, then that claim is possibly false, in which case it's not necessarily true. So it might strike you that, well, look, it seems like those kinds of claims might possibly be false. Well, if it seems that way to you, then there's only two things that can be going on. One, either the claim is genuinely possibly false, or it merely appears to you that it might be possibly false. If it's the second case, if it's only that it appears to be possibly false, even though it really couldn't be possibly false, then we need to explain that illusion, say how it happens. Now, the way Kripke, we'll get into more detail on this in a moment, but his idea here is that S1, the claim that water is H2O, is not genuinely possibly false. It only appears possibly false, in which case we've got to explain the illusion, and we can, he thinks, explain why.
So, only distilled water is H2O, right? Like if you buy a bottle of water, it's not just H2O. It has a bunch of other things like sodium and magnesium. So technically,
sure.
most water is H2O.
Well, it is H2O. It's got H2O in it, and without H2O, it wouldn't be water. So if you look at all the things that we call water, at the very least, all of them are going to have as their essential property, and this is important for Kripke's view, H2O. So that's the thing without which they wouldn't be H2O. So if we look at the bottle and we see the other, say, minerals that it has or something, other samples of what we call water won't have those things, but we'll call it water because it does have H2O. Whereas anything that, if we just pointed to something that had those other minerals, it wouldn't count as water unless it had H2O. So the claim is that it's the essential property for water is that it have H2O, where an essential property is the thing without which it couldn't be that thing. Okay? So I have to go over this fairly quickly, otherwise once I get to 10 minutes, I'm just going to stop and we'll move on to functionalism. But I just wanted to lay it out a little bit more clearly. So we've got to explain this illusion. Why does it seem like water could not be H2O. We'll do that in a moment. By the same token, Kripke thinks that S2, the claim that pain is identical to C fibers firing, is genuinely possibly false. And the strategy for explaining how it might only appear possibly false is not available. It is available in the case of water and H2O, why that seems possibly false. But pain being identical to C fibers firing, that's genuinely possibly false. And we can't appeal to this strategy for explaining the illusion. So what's the strategy? Here it is. So when S1, the claim that water is H2O, appears possibly false, the explanation is this. So we pick out water in the first instance on Kripke's view by pointing to stuff. That stuff in the puddle over there, the stuff flowing in the river, the stuff falling from the sky as rain, etc. And then we empirically investigate that stuff to find out what its essential property is. And then we discover that it's H2O. And we discovered that that's what it is essentially. So what's going on here, the illusion is that it's possible that clear, odorless liquid, or the stuff flowing in that river or whatever, might not be H2O. It might be some other type of liquid that merely has those external properties of being clear, odorless, etc. But the point is that on Kripke's view, it's not possible that water is not H2O. Once we have picked out the reference of water by saying that stuff, the clear, odorless stuff in the river, empirically investigated, you find out that what it actually is H2O, essentially, then it's just not possibly false that water is H2O. But of course, clear, odorless liquid, you wouldn't want to just walk into your friend's chemistry lab and take a gulp out of anything that looked clear and odorless, right? It could be anything. So clear, odorless liquid might not be H2O, but water is H2O, necessarily on this view. Now take, by contrast, S2, pain is identical to C fibers firing. So when that seems possibly false to us, in the way that it might seem possibly false that water is H2O, there's no similar explanation available. How do we pick out pain? If you say, I'm in pain, I say, how do you know you're in pain? You say, well, I feel pain, okay? So effectively we say this is pain, and we pick out what is essential to being pain directly in that case. It's just what it feels like to be in pain. That's the only thing that's essential to being in pain. And if that's right, then it's very different from the situation with water. If the only thing that's essential to being pain is that it feels like pain, then it's possible, given that that's the essential property of it's just how it feels, a mental, phenomenal property, that it's not C fibers firing. It's at least possible that that claim that pain is identical to C fibers firing is false. And if it's possibly false, even possibly false, then it's not necessarily true. And so it can't be a proper identity claim. And so if it can't be a property identity claim, then the identity theorist's claim, which is that it is an identity claim, is false. The identity theory is wrong, according to Kripke, for this reason. So if we go back to the main kind of argument here, we add 7 then, because that claim, the claim that pain is C fibers firing, is possibly false, and we don't have any strategy for explaining away the illusion that we might have in the case of water, it turns out that S2 is false, and strictly speaking, it's necessarily false. The worst possible verdict you could have for your argument. So when you put an argument together for your term paper, and I write back, your conclusion is necessarily false, right? You'll be very dismayed, because that's like the worst thing. Well, it's not the worst thing. An invalid argument would be the worst thing, but in any case. Okay, so that's the strategy that Kripke has. I'm only going over this because part of the assessment task 2 requires knowing a little bit about this, at least, and being able to sketch out the main form of the problem. So we just need to have that in mind. A question quickly.
Why is it necessarily false?
Right. That's just falling out of the overall kind of semantics that Kripke has. But the idea here is that if something is, for an identity claim like this, because it's required that if it's true at all, it be necessarily true. If it's possibly false, then it's actually necessarily false.
Because it's not an identity claim.
Yeah, because if it were true at all, in virtue of being an identity claim, it would have to be necessarily true.